This episode is brought to you by Pure 39, empowering CTV advertisers with comprehensive pre-bid and reporting solutions for targeting and brand suitability. Why settle for non-transparent CTV campaigns when you can select the channels, content, and genres your ad will run on? With over 2,000 CTV signals to apply and report on, you'll be able to customize your targeting, suitability, and optimizations directly in your DSP of choice. If you're looking for more control of your CTV buys, visit pure39.com/CTV. That's PEER39.com/CTV to learn more. This podcast is brought to you by Moloko. Moloko empowers businesses of all sizes to grow through advanced machine learning solutions that deliver digital growth and performance for customers. With advertising solutions across mobile apps, retail media, and streaming media monetization, Moloko can supercharge your growth. Join industry leaders such as Bumble, DraftKings, and Playtrix, and discover more at moloko.com/podcast. That's moloko.com/podcast. Welcome to the Marketecture Podcast. I'm Ari Paparo. I'm joined today by our special guest. I'm very excited about this episode, John Battelle. So John has been a legend in our industry. He was the founder of Wired Magazine, the founder of the Industry Standard, the founder of Federated Media, author of the book The Search. He's currently the chairperson of Sovereign Holdings. He's been involved in everything involving media, journalism. I have a giant stack of Wired magazines in my living room with all of the bright colored spines as a form of decoration. So I'm really excited about this. Let's go through some quick housekeeping. So this week we had a great vendor interview on Marketecture with Viant. Probably everyone listening to this at this point has heard about Viant and their new AI product. I talked to Chris and Tim and got to the bottom of what's available exactly, how does it work, that sort of thing. So that is free outside the paywall until Monday. Next week is advertising week, so probably a lot of people have a lot going on. There's a party that Eric and I and a bunch of other people are hosting on Monday. If you haven't gotten an RSVP that says, yes, you're in, you're probably not in. We're totally oversubscribed. Don't show up +1, please. But if you are RSVP'd, then please show up. Look forward to seeing you. I'll be the person not talking to anyone in the corner. And then we have some other things I'm doing next week. So I am hosting AdTech Jeopardy at the Pontiac Summit. And that is a sponsor of Marketecture, but I'm just bringing it up because it's so cool. I got a demo of it. They're doing a full Jeopardy with the sound effects, the double Jeopardy, everything like that. And I'm going to be the Alex Trebek. So if you are interested, their tickets are still available. And lastly, I'm also interviewing Peter Giordano, the GM of ads platform for DoorDash, at the Scale Up Lounge at Advertising Week on Wednesday. So if you have a chance to pop by, I think it's at like 2:15 on Wednesday, I'll be talking about retail media. Whew, a lot going on. Eric, do you have anything you want to plug for next week for Advertising Week?
Yeah, similarly, I'll be hiding in probably a different corner on the Monday night, and then Appearam is co-hosting another party on Wednesday night. The name escapes me, but we'll put it in the show notes.
I don't remember getting an invite to that Wednesday party.
All right, we'll end this offline.
Okay, enough of this. So I didn't mention Eric Franchi, as usual. Thank you for being here. So let's get to our main guest. John, thank you so much for taking the time to join the Marketecture Podcast.
I'm very happy to be here.
Did I get your whole bio right, or did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think
important?
probably the only thing that I should, just as a caveat, also mention is that I'm currently a director of LiveRamp, which is a player related to the whole ecosystem here. So that should be noted so people can determine my inherent biases.
Sure. You're the second LiveRamp board member we've had in the past month because we had Brian O'Kelly on. And I
saw that Brian interview. That's right.
Yeah. I made a little joke at the time that sometimes it's a little bit hard to get a LiveRamp person on the phone, and we should I needed an in. And the CEO, Scott Howe, reached out to me and said, anytime. So if you're listening to this and the LiveRamp reps are not being as responsive as you like, the workflow is to text me so I could text Scott so that someone can get yelled at and they'll return your call. That is
that's kind of how it all works. Ever since Twitter became X, it's harder to get customer service.
So tell me about the earliest days of Wired in particular. For those, there are probably some people here who are too young to have really...
There are people, I am sure, who are listening who were not born when Wired launched.
Wired was changed my life. It was like this weird avant-garde art magazine about technology, kind of. How would you describe it?
I mean, I think that's certainly a fair description, but it is one of those, blind people and an elephant kind of thing, because it was the realization of a desire to tell a story that I thought was the most important story ever, which was the story of how technology was changing our society. And I had earlier in my career, and it's funny to say that because I was like 25 when we launched Wired, but I had spent 3 or 4 years covering Apple and networking and kind of, geeky, computer stuff in the 1980s. And, people who read what I wrote were all IT people who bought computers for companies. That was the intended target audience. And I was certain that everyone in the world should know how big a deal technology was. I just didn't know exactly how to do that. I had this idea for a magazine in graduate school, and I got laughed out of the building. They're like, you don't know how to start a magazine, I'm like, well, not really. You're right. But then I ran into the co-founders, Lewis and Kevin and John and Jane, and we kind of formed a band, and we put out our first album. That was really the first issue of Wired. And it was funky and looked unlike anything else, and it was provocative. And for me, though, it was readable, right? I mean, I was the managing editor, so my job was to, edit every word in the magazine. And my parents could read it. My friends who were lawyers or, in real estate or finance, they could read it and understand it. And that was my goal, is to tell this story in the kind of language that, normal people could understand. Because in the early 1990s, it was absolutely not cool to care passionately about technology. That came later. I think Wired was part of bridging from kind of not cool to being cool. And one of the sort of the costume that we put on was, a cool one. We looked cool, and our designer was really, really good. And so you mentioned those spines that that are sort of a trademark of Wired. That was very intentional. They were built as things to be saved and to be put on bookshelves and used as art. So it was a very intentional process, and it actually worked, which was, of course, a huge surprise to all of us.
Yeah, I have a theory. I call it the Big Bang Theory, which is that the TV show, The Big Bang Theory, charts the coolness and decline of tech, because only when tech actually started becoming cool would they put a TV show like that on CBS, and then it was canceled a couple years ago. So that's kind of the era in which tech was cool. Also, one thing I noticed when I was just doing some research for this episode was that Wired was founded in 1992, which is really interesting year because that's at least 2 years before the commercial internet.
That's right.
I don't think you could even register a .com address until
no, you
a little bit later than that. So did you see that coming, or are you writing a magazine for CD-ROMs and other things?
Well, it's funny you would ask, because the very last thing that we did when we created the first issue, which came out January 93. So we were building the issue in the fall of 92. And right before we went to print, I came up with this idea of sort of taking all the stuff we didn't get in the magazine, and I wrote this little column of flotsam and, jetsam called Flux. And it went through the entire front of the book, and it was in 6-point type. You could you really couldn't read it. But it was there. And one of the items I had in there was about this little interesting experiment at CERN by Tim Berners-Lee called the World Wide Web. And so we managed to get a mention of that in the first issue of Wired, which I think, our credibility could have suffered if we had launched Wired and not even mentioned the World Wide Web. But by the time we did our next issue, which was a couple months later, it was really evident what a big deal this was. And, we had pivoted from kind of the CD-ROM / multimedia information superhighway to, holy shit, this is going to change everything, because it really did pay off the ideas that I had covering Apple with the Macintosh user interface, the graphical user interface, which I thought was a miracle, and the networking, the power of networking on the back end of that interface. That's the web. And I'd been thinking about that for, as long as I'd been thinking about tech. I was certain that this was coming. There was an online service in the 80s that Apple had called Apple Link, and it was really good. It was really, really good. And it was like AOL without sort of all the cruddy parts. And so I was, from an early, age, pretty convinced that the online thing was going to be a big deal. It's just that we had to solve some interface and some bandwidth issues.
It was famous that I think in 1992, 93, Bill Gates wrote a whole book called The Road Ahead and didn't mention the internet
which
once.
Essentially missed the internet entirely. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wired, just a quick anecdote, sort of changed my life a little bit because I was down in Washington, D.C. after college. I had sort of a dead end job, and I had a hipster friend who was not very technical at all. And he came to visit, and he showed up with a Wired magazine. I think it was the one that had Sonic the Hedgehog on the cover. And he was
I
like,
wrote that story.
Yeah. He was like, dude, man, everything's changing. It's technology. You got to get in on it, man. I don't know what you're doing here in D.C. And I read the magazine. I was like, he's right. And I moved to New York and pursued a career in technology. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I hear a lot of stories like that. Ev Williams, who was one of the founders of Twitter, told me a story about just sort of stumbling across a copy of Wired in Nebraska on a newsstand somewhere and moving to California to start Odeo and then Twitter. So I hear a lot of those great stories, and that, it's sort of like the early web, but when you started a magazine back when magazines mattered, you kind of cast it out on the water and hope for some response, right? And you don't know if it's working until the mail-in cards from inside the magazine start coming back, right? And people are subscribing by writing like their credit card number on an open postcard, right? That they send into the mail.
That's nuts.
And it's like, okay, you guys are worried about putting your credit card on the internet, but no problem, put it on a postcard. But we got tens of thousands of them back in the couple of months after that first issue. And we knew we had a hit on our hands, and that was exciting. It was, and then it was off to the races. I mean, I don't think any of us left the office for about 3 years.
John, if I think about Wired, I think about, the early days of the internet and the ascension of the .com bubble, and, being a salesperson at About.com at the time, and, just spending a lot of time in various offices. And Wired was strewn about all over the place.
Yeah.
Like it was
like a membership
ubiquitous
badge in a way.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
What was it like for you covering the .com bubble?
Well, actually, that's, Ari mentioned that the next thing I did after that was the Industry Standard, which was an online site, conference business, and a magazine, a weekly magazine that covered the .com bubble. And I was at Wired in 96, noticing it inflate and saying to my, colleagues at Wired, I was in charge of business development at Wired for reasons that still escape me. And I said, we should start another magazine that covers this internet thing, and we should do a business angle on it, because that's what's driving it. Everyone's looking to make money now and commercialize this internet opportunity. And my, co-editors, Kevin Kelly and Louis Rossetto, were like, that's a really good idea, John, but it's not kind of sexy enough. Like Wired is cool and sexy, and covering internet business is sort of boring and non-sexy. Even though, there's a lot of, crazy companies that are getting in crazy valuations. It's not a Wired thing, so let's, so sorry, we're not going to do it. So I left in 97 to do that, to do the Industry Standard. And the first thing I did, because I was the founding CEO of this new enterprise, was decide not to be the editor. I had been an editor for the brief 6 years of my career. I'd been a journalist and an editor. But I thought, it's such a big deal to be the CEO. You can't also be the editor. You need to create that, wall between editorial and commercial business. So I hired a really good editor, journalist guy who was covering the Valley for the LA Times. And he became the editor of the Standard, and I was the CEO. I did write the entire editorial plan, though, and I did architect kind of how we were going to cover it and all of that. And essentially our approach was to take the skepticism of The Economist and the sort of authoritative voice that it has and combine it with the insidery voice of like a Variety, right? Like, we're coming from the heart of the beast here. We're in the town, we're in the industry. And we were right in the center of San Francisco, right in the middle of the first boom. And it was bananas. Anybody who could sort of speak a few sentences cogently and had an idea, seemed to be able to get funding and hire a team and go pursue something, right? And if they were particularly adept at, spinning bullshit, they could actually go public, and so we made a practice of covering this, with real skepticism, and that magazine took off faster than Wired did. And it got very, very big. And then every single company that got formed wanted to have a page of advertising in that magazine to sort of validate their existence, I guess. And so, I mean, many
Didn't
people
you once have like a 250 ad page episode?
Well, more actually. I think we topped out at over 300 pages in 1 week.
That's crazy. How much does a page cost back in the day?
It was about 14,000 when we in the middle there. I think we got it up past 20. The magazine made something like $20 million in profit in its third year, and then everything hit a wall in late 2000. I mean, obviously the NASDAQ crashed in April or May of 2000, but the advertising dried up about a quarter later, and we went from a run rate of about $200+ million to a run rate of $45 million in literally one quarter, from Q4 to Q1. We more than 75% drop in revenues. And this is when we had leases totaling about $75 million obligations.
Right.
And so
you had a really nice office in San Francisco, right?
Yeah,
you were known for having
we had
rooftop
8
parties.
offices in San Francisco. We also had
8
14
offices.
Yeah, and we had 4. We actually put a billboard up in the middle of Jackson Square with all of our offices, because people were always getting lost, like which office should they go to for the meeting. So we literally put up a huge billboard.
That's so crazy.
Stupid. I mean, but this is well before, there were smartphones and the ability to, find shit using Google Maps. But it was a crazy time. And when the Standard went down, as it did spectacularly, it was front page news on the Wall Street Journal, and it was, an obituary in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. And we became kind of the poster child for the excesses of the period, which is somewhat crazy because our journalism actually called out those excesses all the way to the end. But we did have great parties. You guys mentioned some parties you're doing for Ad Week next week. We had great parties. And I think there's nothing better, particularly for old school media, than to beat up on media. Media loves to beat up on media. And so we got our fair share of, brutalist coverage. And that really formed me for the next, 15 or 20 years of my entrepreneurial career, is like the ability to just take that kind of abuse and be a public figure. It really hardened me for the next things to come.
So a lot of the early times that we're talking about had prognostications about how the internet was going to change everything. And it did change everything, but often in ways people didn't expect. And we talk a lot about on this pod about journalism and media and how it's supported. And maybe you could give us some sense for, what you thought was going to happen to media as everything went digital, and where it didn't go the way you expected and where you might have been surprised.
My third company was essentially a declaration of what I thought the future of media was going to be, right? When the crash happened and, everyone kind of went home, San Francisco in 2001, if either of you were there, you might recall, was a ghost town. You would walk around that town and there would be nobody on the streets because an industry had just basically been wiped out. And there was sort of a recession that was driven by the dot-com boom on top of that. But really, San Francisco had become a boom town. And it's always like this. San Francisco is famously a boom and bust town. But being in the center of it was really something. It felt like the pandemic, But there were shoots of new growth. And one of them was down in Mountain View, Google. And then those guys were partying like the dot-com bust never stopped. I mean, the dot-com boom never stopped, right? Things were just great at Google. And they were also great at Overture, which, became Yahoo's temporary answer to Google in terms of commercializing the web. But what I noticed, I started a blog in about 2003, and I noticed that a lot of people were coming, and I was writing every day, and a lot of people were reading and responding, and it was really cool. And I thought, wow, this just might be the future of media. Everybody's going to have their own domain, their own space, and Google is going to stitch it all together, because Google really did use blogs as some of the early trace routes for how they built PageRank and their search index. I thought, well, there's got to be a business in here somewhere. So I built Federated Media, which was a back end for bloggers, essentially, to make money and do the hard ad op stuff that most people don't want to do. And I really believed that this idea that the intelligence and the value and the data and the journalism would thrive at the edges, and that,
Right.
what I did not imagine was the consolidation back to 4 or 5 big companies, just like it had been in other media forms, right? ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox. I just thought, wow, finally we're getting this, pre-Cambrian explosion where, millions of nodes on the edge will be kind of how the media ecosystem looks. Now, if you look at where we are today, I would say we got that. But what we didn't imagine was how powerful the gravity of those 4 or 5 huge planets at the center were, and how much of the value those mass companies extract, and how much of the external kind of, tens of millions of sites and voices and, Substacks and Instagram, persona, how they are driven by the mass at the center, and how the rules are essentially and effectively laid by that mass at the center. That's what I had missed. I missed that. And it was about 2009 or 10, which was a few years into Facebook's ascendance and Google's response to that, that I began noticing the takeover of, the global giants in the internet space. And I started writing pretty vociferously against it. And by 2011, 2012, when Facebook incorporated the newsfeed, you may recall, and then put advertising into the newsfeed, when I said, oh shit, it's game over for this whole approach to the web that I thought was going to happen. And of course, you may recall one of the things that I co-founded was the Web 2 events with Tim O'Reilly. And we had laid out all of these principles of how the internet was going to work at Web 2. And everyone was so excited from 2003, 4 through about 2012 about how this was all going to develop, and we were all going to share data through RSS feeds and, and this and that and the other. Very little of that came to fruition, particularly, with the rise of Apple and the App Store and sort of the consolidation of control that occurred, as a result of that business model. So got that wrong.
Yeah. So we could talk about this for an hour, but in the early 2000s, I had a blog. I was a very early blogger, and it was amazing that you could write something and it would show up on Google the next day. The Google's actually doing its job of indexing the web and making it accessible. And that was a feedback loop that was great. And then you had tools like RSS, et cetera. And now we're left with we have the ability to publish. No one's taken that away. You can have a blog, you can be on Substack, you can have a podcast, but no one's going to see it unless you do some more stuff. Was there a solution missed? Was there some left turn where, maybe, Facebook has dabbled with the idea of supporting journalism a million times, then pulled back, and then gone forward and pulled back? Was there a white knight that could have made this all work and missed the turn?
I'm actually in the middle of thinking pretty hard about that, because I do have a fair amount of time to stroke my chin these days. My last company, I landed a year and a half ago, and I swore up and down to everyone dear to me that I would not start my 9th company. So I've had some time to think about it, and it's become a bit of an obsession trying to get an answer to this, Ari. And I don't know that I do, but I can give you a couple examples of things that, I guess you could call it sort of counter history. Like, what if this had happened, right? What if when, the sort of furry, fuzzy group of people who created the internet standards early in the day hadn't decided that we didn't need to incorporate identity as part of the core, internet protocols, half for political reasons, but the other half really just for technical reasons. It was just really hard to do given the technology at that time, to imagine a distributed, verified, validated identity system. So kind of punted on that. And of course, identity has been the bugaboo of everything since, right? It's the reason the whole ad tech programmatic, system got built, was to try to recompose a lack of identity that has dogged the advertising business ever since. And another thing I think, specific to what you mentioned, Ari, about journalism and media, is there was a moment when Google really was 100% the sort of well-intended connection matrix for the entire internet.
Yep.
And at that moment, they could have decided to build essentially a micropayment system into their infrastructure that would have allowed some kind of a payment for attention to occur, so that I could just read that Chicago Tribune piece and pay 7 cents or 70 cents or $7, depending on what the Tribune decided it was worth or I decided it was worth. But that kind of a at scale system was almost beyond the capability of our society to understand in the sort of mid 2000s, which is about the time it should have been built in, really.
If I could interrupt for 1 second, I mean, Google killing off Google Reader was kind of the greatest sin of that generation.
And I don't think that a lot of people really understood how big a deal that was. Especially if you weren't using Google Reader directly, you're like, okay, who cares? Well, was a spike in the heart of the sort of distributed internet. And for them, it was I get a sense that it was probably just an accounting decision.
Right. But then they spend $1 billion trying to recreate Facebook's news feed when they had it. they had it, right?
And so there's a lot of these, I think the way the App Store was rolled out, it could probably be another seminal moment where, decisions were taken there that became the corporate DNA of Apple in terms of control. And, probably the most anti-open web platform in the world is the App Store, right? It's just absolutely the opposite of an open system. Open systems are messy and have a lot of gray and have a lot of potential for fraud. But, walk out to, Herald Square or, Times Square or, any public square, there's a lot of mess and gray and fraud. That's just the world. And I prefer the world to sanitized versions of the world that are extractive, which is, I think, what we got.
Yeah. So speaking of mess and fraud, I want to kind of close this up with one very broad question, which is after, this many years in these industries, how do you feel about ad tech? Is it a dirty word to you? Necessary evil?
It's certainly not a dirty word. I think you might say it's a necessary pain in the ass. But I don't think it's an evil. But I do think it's very poorly conceived and it's very poorly understood. By conceived, I mean that I think it could be architected much more elegantly, but there are core pieces for that elegant architecture that simply no one company can make. That includes the identity piece, though, many companies like the aforementioned LiveRamp are working on that. But I think it's not well understood. I wrote a piece, which maybe you can put in the show notes, arguing that the programmatic ad system is actually the greatest artifact ever created by humankind. And I still believe that. And I believe that infrastructure for essentially auctioning value in real time at insane scale is probably, fundamentally important to anything we do next for humanity. And so, I think ad tech's going to end up being really, really important. And so I would never slag it.
So 10,000 years from now, when you have the ruins of society and some archaeologists of the future is digging, they're going to get to some layer and scream out, "They were cookie syncing! They were cookie syncing!"
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with the news of the week. This podcast is sponsored by Adelaide. You've probably heard of Adelaide by now. This month, they announced a new product, Adelaide for Publishers. For the first time, publishers can leverage attention metrics to curate inventory, deliver attention insights, and drive higher CPMs. Join the Weather Company, NPR, Westwood One, Cumulus Media, and other leading publishers taking advantage of the attention economy's most popular metric, AU. Maybe one day Mark will convince me to sell guaranteed AU slots on Marketecture, but probably not. Check out adelaidemetrics.com/AFP for more information.
All right, and we're back with news of the week. Hey, quick clarification before we get into it. We mentioned there is a party during advertising week in the beginning, and my mind blanked on the name. If you all go to unpluggedcollective.com, scroll down. The party is themed Strangers No More. And I think you can sign up for it on the site. So, Ari, you can get your invite there. I'll be there. The parent team will be there. Maybe Ari will be there. We'll hang out on Wednesday.
Sorry, I'm busy that night. Got plans.
Get into it. All right. So, all right, you had in the newsletter this week on Monday an interesting post, basically asking where is the AI? You posted it on X, and you got a bunch of engagement. Let me summarize it, and then I want to talk about it for a second. I'd actually love to get John's take on AI and how it's just kind of playing out right now. Basically, you said that the big platforms, are far in advance with AI, right? So not putting words in your mouth, but like Advantage Plus and PMax, both like 10-figure revenue businesses. You said there's some like interesting things happening at the edges with a couple of the algorithmic companies. But what you identified was that like established ad tech, Viant aside, doesn't seem to be embracing AI, doesn't seem to be putting things forward. Like I read that and it was a little bit of a head scratcher for me because I live in this little world of, early stage startups, and basically everything that we've invested in and we've talked about, on the pod a little bit has been like early stage AI, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding where you're going with this and you're seeing a gap in, the companies that are out there at scale and they're not moving fast enough.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary of what I wrote. You have a lot of startups. We're getting, and you're an investor, so you're seeing decks all the time. We're using AI to automate whatever. Great, good for you. But the companies that have hundreds of clients or 10 to 100 million in revenue, pretty quiet. A couple of folks like Mediaocean Flash Talking seem to be investing pretty heavily. Clinch reached out to me to tell me about what they're doing. So people are doing stuff. I just imagine that if I was in, especially on any ad tech platform that touches creative, I would be full steam ahead. I would be figuring out what customers want and giving it to them. And, if you just kind of do a survey of the who's who of ad tech and look for AI, there's not that much. There's not a lot of announcements, not a lot of press releases. And we talked about this on the pod last week. The big holding companies, agencies are investing a lot, but haven't shown much of anything except for, pretty vaguely worded press releases.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. And I think it also bodes well for startups that, can figure this thing out and become the next gen. John, you've seen everything. What's your take on AI?
I think we're upside down on the sexy, headline grabbing portion of it. The Gen AI stuff, the chatbots, the, seeming fluent intelligence portion of it that has captured everyone's attention is so fucking expensive. Am I allowed to say, can I curse on
There's a checkbox in Spotify that I'll have to check for this week.
I can restate it if you'd like. That's so freaking.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. It's so expensive at scale, and the value is not yet established, nor is the ecosystem extant that allows people to, plug into things they don't want to build and get things built in a way that is consistent. You can do A, B, and C if you're developing something cool. But if you're partnering with, E, F, and G, and two of them go out of business in the next 2 years, right? It's just too new and it's not established enough. And I think what almost all these companies, the 10 million to 100 million plus revenue companies in our space are doing is much less sexy, which is basically machine learning, algorithms to deal with bid flow and identifying patterns in traffic and, segments and stuff like that. It's not very sexy, but like at Sovereign, this stuff has changed our business in the last couple of years, and I won't speak for LiveRamp because I'm just a director, but, I think it's similar at companies like that, public companies. It's like, you can't over rotate on this stuff and just issue a press release and say you're doing shit. You have to show real value for customers. And I think that we're not yet at an architecture of how this snaps together that allows for true innovation to occur And I think part of that is because we haven't quite gotten to the question of whose information at what price, right? So this is a bigger conversation, but I do think that we don't have the right model yet for creating value for the individual agency of an individual at the end point of delivery of some service of value that a company is going to pay for. We have work to do, and I think we're in the sort of ugly middle of it right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even though it's the unsexy stuff, it's the things that are actually driving business outcomes. One sexy thing though. So this week, I began playing with Notebook LM. Have you guys taken a look at it?
Yeah. Steven's thing. I mean, Steven Johnson is involved in that. He's an author that I've been friends with for many, many years. We started companies together in the 90s. He's amazing. And he was one of the architects of Notebook LM. Yeah.
It is so good. So for the listeners, if you haven't checked it out yet, you absolutely should. Just go to notebooklm.google.com. Effectively, what you can do is upload anything. So I've uploaded annual reports. I've uploaded Ari's newsletters. And you get back, depending on the length and complexity of the document, a like 7 to 15 minute narrated podcast in conversation form, just like this, with a woman and a man's voice, and it is awesome. And it dissects it in a very plain way. And I've been playing with this thing all week. Other people have. They've already hacked the system and have figured out how to like make the characters talk to each other about a potential relationship that might be brewing between them. It's like the internet's obsession. Yeah. It only lasts a week, but you should check it out.
So Eric, you ran some of the Monopoly report through it to talk about the antitrust trial, right?
Yeah. I can't play it for technical purposes. I'm going to download it and send it to you. You can see if you can.
So if you're listening to this podcast after we have our usual close, we'll put in some of the audio of that, and we'll see how much fun it is.
It is so much fun. They mispronounce your name, but
of course,
don't hold it against them.
No,
it's really good. Anyway, all right, let's move on. Quick thing on, we've done Google to death. Ari, you probably don't want to talk about this, but there was an interesting post in BI this week. Arte Research, which is a firm that kind of covers ad tech a little bit from the outside, they proposed that Google spins out the ad tech piece, which everybody's been talking about, and actually make it a B Corp, which would cap the profits of it, but still be a giant business.
Sorry, I was just doing a bong hit. Yeah, B Corp, let's do it, man. Let's take all the profit out, make it socialist ad tech. Yeah.
All right, John, what you got?
I'm not sure that's ever going to happen. And anyway, wasn't OpenAI a B Corp or?
It was a nonprofit. It was not even a B Corp. It was a nonprofit until this week.
I need to fact check that, but I don't buy it.
At the trial, in all seriousness, there were several people who suggested that ad server should be a nonprofit or a social good of some kind, including some Google people in their documents. So it's not a unheard of idea. It just has like a zero likelihood of happening.
Yeah, it's like it'll be the Con Ed of ad tech.
Can you imagine?
It's like a public utility. I guess. Anyway, okay, we'll move on. This stuff is interesting here. So Amazon is on an absolute tear with video, and John, to kind of nod to what you were saying, in terms of a handful of companies just absolutely owning things. So first, Amazon, they booked more than their target in upfront video ad commitments. I think the target was 1.8 billion. They didn't actually announce the number, but confirmed that they exceeded that number. And they're one of 5 streamers that are going to book more than $1 billion in upfront ad commitments. The other thing that they said is they're going to be increasing the ad load in Prime Video in 2025. So they basically experimented making Prime Video either fully ad supported for all the people that have it, or creating a paid tier. The paid tier, they wouldn't give a number, but less than 20% of the analyst estimates they said is paying for it. So this is a ad supported thing, and they're going to be showing more ads. I've already seen ad load. It went from 1 ad to now 4 or 5 ads over the course of the past month or so. So they're cranking out the supply, and as market participants have noted, that's been putting a bit of a damper on CPMs. The other thing that they noted was they're adding shoppable formats, so somewhat like Roku, be able to shop with the remote. John, Would you have predicted Amazon becoming the ad juggernaut that it is now when they first started?
Yes. And that's only because I've been watching this ads business since they started it. Since, remember when they had a little search effort called A9?
Yeah.
A9 became their ad tech, which became their advertising business. First, it was just, merchandising right on Amazon.com. But it was obvious that that data set could travel. And it did, right? And then they built what they built. And then when they announced Prime, it was, just a matter of waiting till, there's no large corporation that's going to say, no, let's not take advantage of the fact that we might add another billion or two to our bottom line. They're going to do it. And they did. And they continue to do it. And the funny thing that, I predicted when we started a company, the one that I mentioned earlier, that my last one, the Recount, which was trying to do online video news. And I say trying because it is very, very hard to do in any way to make money at it. We predicted that streaming would rebundle and that a core part of that bundle would have to be news. And so we were going to build that news thing that would get rebundled, right? I think we're right in the vision and completely wrong in the timing. It took much longer than I expected, but it's happening, right? Now when you put on Max or Prime or, any number of the other ones, there's almost always a live portion of it where you can, there's live stuff happening. There's news, there's sports, there's, that stuff. It feels, frankly, like a worse version of cable from 1990. I mean, don't get me started about how bad streaming is when it comes to like finding stuff, right? but at the same time, the ad loads are impressively non-specific given how much data there is, right? Although I will say there have been a couple of ads that have freaked me out, that they're so specific, like a very specific medical condition that I particularly have because of my genetic history. I've never seen an ad for this thing, and there it is, right? And I'm like, okay, when did I search for that? Was that like, was that like in 2017 when I found out about it? Like that was the last time how did this happen? Because it's usually the same ads over and over. And then all of a sudden, boom, I'm like, there it is, the glimmering of what's coming. It's building, it's starting to happen. And I think it's going to be pretty spectacular once it gets to scale. The ability to do really specific advertising, particularly as Ari, you pointed out, once we get the creative stuff worked out and it's not as costly to build, on the fly, really high quality, very specific creative.
Yeah, another great use case for AI, and where a lot of startups are participating, because you can do creative without necessarily requiring, OpenRTB, programmatic, et cetera. You can just build a business like smartly, ship over the creative, and still add a lot of value. So it's definitely one of the frontiers.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, you want to talk about some of the IAB Tech Lab stuff? Yeah,
so the IAB is having an event on the West Coast about cookies and signal loss, and they made two announcements. I don't think either one was unexpected, but they're meaningful. The first is that the IAB has taken on Pair. So Pair is Google's solution for onboarding publisher data. It's kind of like an alternative to UID2. It's been embraced by LiveRamp. It's been embraced by a lot of folks. It has one big advantage over a alternative ID like UID2 or ID5, which is that it can't be shared across publishers. So an advertiser can pair their data with a given publisher and a second publisher, and those two publishers can't use the data in any way. It's not an ID. It's a sync. So that's interesting that Google was willing to move that to becoming a standard. I have no information about take up or how popular it is or anything like that. And the second one is that in response to ID bridging, which is a subject that was pretty hot a couple months ago, where publishers are kind of trying to guess which user is visiting their site on environments where they aren't certain what ID to use. So they're sort of shoving a bunch of IDs into the programmatic streams. The IAB has proposed a standard or released a standard for what they're calling ID provenance, which is effectively metadata along with each ID to say where it came from. Is this a cookie? Is it a made? Is it a implied made, a statistical made, things like that. So I think these are great things for the IAB to be working on, and it's all mom and apple pie from here.
Mom and apple pie. Amazing. Okay, let's get into some rumors. We always have rumors. So first is Video Amp is apparently for sale. Sarah Fisher, always with the scoop in Axios. So Video Amp has raised $606 million to date, including a $150 million Series G by Vista Credit. Their last equity valuation was during their Series F raise in 2021, which was $1.4 billion. And it sounds like Vista Credit is kind of leading the charge on the sale exploration. Just having that as the last round, there's probably some complexity on preference. You no longer have a CEO. There's been some layoffs. I guess the real question is, this is a very valuable asset for the right buyer, but is this $1 billion company?
Yeah, if you recall, at our year-end show, we had predictions, and you asked me to call out a really well-run private ad tech company, and I said Video Amp, and it was about 8 days later they had layoffs and let their CEO go and went into a tailwind spiral. So I'm pretty familiar with this company. But you're right. Basically, they're very strategic. They're a viable alternative to Nielsen, or they're trying to be. But there's two problems with this company. Number one is the majority of the revenue still comes from media instead of measurement. And everyone who looks at this business says they just want measurement. They don't want media. And removing the media would crater the P&L even worse than it already is. And the second problem is out of control spending. They bought a lot of kettlebells, and it's hard to get back that money after you've spent it.
We'll tackle the second one. So the second one is interesting. Mountain is threatening an IPO. That was your note, Ari. I love that one. Mountain has raised $185 million to date for Crunchbase, and their last raise was $119 million Series D in 2021 during the boom times. Mountain is a media business, but Mountain, I think, has a big media business. It's probably got the profile of the type of company that actually can get out. What do you guys think?
You didn't use my joke. They're not joining the Deadpool. Am I the only one who gets the joke? I'm sorry. I put it in the notes. I handed you the joke. What can I do here, man? So anyway, Mountain. Mountain's doing like CTV, retargeting CTV performance. They've been around for a long time. Used to be called, what was their previous name? I can't remember.
Steelhouse.
It's a hot space. You have TV Scientific that you're an investor in. You have Vibe that I'm an investor in. You have other new companies joining the space. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, there hasn't been an ad tech IPO outside of
it takes Ryan Reynolds
in a few years.
I mean, once you have Ryan Reynolds,
how many exits has Ryan Reynolds had?
Well, Mountain would be one of them.
He had Mint. He sold his agency to Mountain, so he does their amazing promotional videos, right. Probably the best promotional videos in ad tech, where Ryan walks through the UI.
I think he's got tequila brand.
He sold a tequila brand for like hundreds of millions of dollars.
That guy.
Ryan Reynolds, the hottest founder in ad tech. Good for him. And a good IPO obviously bodes well for the space. So hopefully this happens. One more before we call it a day. The 30th, which was as of this recording a few days ago, was the official sunsetting of Oracle Ads. There's been a couple of good recap pieces. Omar from formerly of Blue Sky, now Rembrandt, did a pod with that exchanger. Digiday had an article. I noted in the Digiday article that IIS picked up 20 Oracle Ads people. So good to see that they've got some talented folks that are being picked up across the ecosystem. And presumably a couple of these measurement companies have picked up some clients as well.
Yeah, shout out to Pier 39, who is sponsoring this podcast. So good to have an advertiser on board with the news.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Mario said that they had hired a few people as well.
Yeah, pour one out for, I couldn't even name all the brands that went into Oracle Ads. I mean, Blue Sky.
Of course you can.
There's Blue Sky, Share This.
Data Logic. Share This, Moat, Grape Shot.
That's it? Okay. I thought there were a couple more.
I think that's the stack.
It's a lot. It's a lot of logos to get crossed off the Luma charts.
Yeah, billions of dollars. Anyway, this has been great. John, this has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, amazing conversation. Thank you all for joining. And we're going to put in the, what's it called? The Notebook ML.
Notebook LM.
Notebook LM, sorry, which is from Google interpretation of the antitrust trial. It's like a bonus podcast, but the people aren't real, whereas Eric and I are real. So thanks again for listening.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, so get this. We're diving headfirst into day 15 of the Google antitrust trial.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no kidding. And we've got the inside scoop.
Okay.
Straight from Ari Paparo's day 15 newsletter. He's been there all along, soaking it all in.
Oh, a primary source. Gotta love that, especially the case like this.
You said it.
Yeah.
Now, picture this. Day 15 rolls around. Everyone's a little frazzled. Weeks of legal jargon about digital ads. You know the drill.
Oh, yeah.
But here's the kicker. Ari describes this like kumbaya atmosphere in the courtroom.
Kumbaya. Now, that's not something you hear every day, especially in an antitrust trial.
Right. Who knew? So anyway, just a quick recap for anyone tuning in for the first time. This whole shebang is about whether Google created an illegal monopoly in the digital advertising world. You know those ads that follow you around online?
Pretty much unavoidable these days. Seriously. And to prove their case, Google brought in the big guns. Witnesses from companies like BuzzFeed, the New York Times, Vox Media, even Zulily.
Smart move, bringing in the big names. It seems like Google's trying to show that publishers have options. They're not forced to use Google's platform, right? If they don't like the prices, they can just go elsewhere. But I have a feeling it's not that simple.
Oh, absolutely not. And this is where things get really juicy. So Vox Media, during their testimony, they mentioned this thing called dynamic allocation,
Here we go.
which Google apparently invented. And it supposedly boosts ad revenue for publishers.
Ad tech can be a bit of a maze, can it?
Tell me about it. But stay with us, folks. It's important. So basically, what is this dynamic allocation and why does it matter in this whole Google trial?
Okay, so imagine you're the New York Times, right?
Big players. Exactly. And you've got this ad space to sell. Naturally, you want the best price possible. That's where dynamic allocation comes in. It lets Google connect your ad space to multiple ad exchanges. Those are like marketplaces where advertisers bid on ad space, and it does this in real time. Google claims this helps publishers, like the New York Times in our example, snag the highest possible price for their ad space.
So win-win, right? Everyone's happy.
Well, not so fast. The DOJ isn't entirely convinced. They're questioning whether this was a genuine innovation that benefits everyone, or was it a clever way for Google to solidify its grip on the ad tech world.
The plot thickens.
It does. And just when you thought things were wrapping up, the DOJ throws a curveball. They bring in a surprise witness, which, by the way, is pretty unusual at this stage of a trial.
Total courtroom drama, right? And who's this mystery witness? It's Matthew Wheatland from the Daily Mail. And let me tell you, his testimony, it kind of sent shockwaves through the courtroom. But before we dive into all that, why was Wheatland's presence such a big deal?
Okay, so remember what Google was going for with those big-name witnesses. They wanted to paint this picture of the ad tech world as this diverse, competitive landscape where Google's just one player among many, right? Wheatland's testimony, it throws a wrench in that whole narrative.
It's like David versus Goliath, right? The Daily Mail going up against Google. What exactly did Wheatland say that had everyone so riled up?
Well, his testimony basically threw cold water on everything Google's witnesses had been saying. Like, remember how Google was pushing this idea of choice in the ad tech world?
Yeah, lots of choices, everyone wins, that whole thing.
Right. Well, Wheatland argued that just because advertisers have options, it doesn't mean publishers like the Daily Mail actually get better deals from Google.
So he's saying Google still calls the shots.
Yeah, basically. He even went so far as to say that AdX, Google's ad exchange, is actually more expensive than other options out there.
Which totally contradicts Google's claim that they're keeping prices competitive.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. He also disputed that whole thing about switching to apps giving publishers more leverage.
Oh, right. I remember that.
He claimed it's not as easy as Google made it sound.
Wow. Talk about a reality check. So Google's legal team must have been scrambling. How did they respond to all of this?
Well, Google's lawyer basically stuck to their guns. They insisted that the DOJ hadn't actually proven any wrongdoing.
So the old, we're just that good defense.
Pretty much. They argued that everything Google's done is just part of building a successful business, attracting customers, offering a great product.
But the DOJ's arguing that Google's gone beyond just doing good business.
Right. Their whole point is that Google's used its power to stifle competition, that they've crossed a line.
And that brings us to Google's second big argument, innovation.
Right. Google basically said, hey, The digital ad world is constantly changing, and we're the ones pushing things forward.
Classic "we're innovators" argument.
Exactly. They said their innovations benefit everyone. Advertisers, publishers, everyone.
But that can't be a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? Just because something's innovative doesn't mean it's not anti-competitive.
That's exactly what makes this case so fascinating, so important. It all comes down to how we define fair competition in this digital age. And there's no easy answer. It's not black and white.
And I'm guessing that's why this trial has gone on for so long and why everyone's so captivated by it.
You got it. And now we wait for the judge's decision.
I bet everyone's on the edge of their seats. Because let's be real, whatever the judge decides, it's going to have huge implications.
Huge. This could completely reshape the digital advertising landscape.
And affect all of us too, not just the big players.
Oh, absolutely. Everything from how we see ads online to how businesses reach their customers could be affected.
It's a lot to take in. This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about.
It really has. And I love how these firsthand accounts give us a glimpse behind the curtain, you know?
It really makes you think, about all these other battles, these conflicts playing out that we never even hear about.
Right. Like we only see the tip of the iceberg, but underneath.
Exactly. It's all these decisions, these court cases, even the code that gets written that shapes the internet as we know it.
And we rarely stop to think about it, you know?
For sure. And with a case this complex, I mean, where do you even draw the line between innovation and just like being too dominant? It's kind of scary. That's why I'm so glad we have these insider perspectives, you know?
Me too.
Ari Paparo being there in the courtroom, it's like we get a front row seat to this whole legal drama.
Absolutely. It's like edge of your seat stuff.
Totally. And it really underscores this like fundamental tension of the digital age, right?
Yeah.
Balancing innovation with like fairness and competition.
Yeah. It's a tightrope walk for sure. And it's way bigger than just Google, you know?
So true. It's like the whole future of tech is riding on this. So what happens now? Everyone's presented their arguments. The tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Well, now we wait for the judge's decision.
Nail-biting time.
Right. And whatever the judge decides, it's going to have huge ripple effects.
No doubt. This could literally rewrite the rules of digital advertising.
And you know what that means? It affects all of us. How we consume content, how businesses reach us, everything.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling like this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Oh, absolutely. And isn't that what it's all about? Making us question things, look deeper.
Totally. So we've broken down some pretty complex stuff, heard both sides of the story. Hopefully we've given everyone some food for thought.
Definitely. And maybe, just maybe, you can use this to impress your friends at your next dinner party.
Hey, did you hear about dynamic allocation?
Okay, maybe leave the technical jargon to us.
But seriously, folks, keep asking questions. Stay curious.
And never underestimate the power of a good deep dive. Until next time.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.